Julie, you've written on sex industry, both in Britain, inner city Britain, as well as international. Do you think religion generally is compatible with secularism? Are they contradictory? And what does that mean in in the work that you've done? That's the question. I know you prepared a speech, but is that sort of something that your experience that you want to sort of?
Well, it's more that I think the police and unfortunately many men on the left will excuse crimes towards women and children if perpetrated, certainly within this country, by some men from the Muslim community. These crimes are not committed because these men are of Muslim origin. They're committed because they are men who know that they are likely to get away with it. But unfortunately what then happens is a cultural relativism that is just horrifically dangerous for women and children, in which white liberals and the police react to them will sooner protect horrendous abuse than run the risk of being called racist. And so many young people in my journalism and in my research that I've found have been procured into sexual exploitative situations have been given a very, very raw deal when their abusers are Muslim origin. Now, the point is that when the racists and the BNP, as you all well know, ascribe a particular significance to men, for example, of Pakistani origin who run pimping gangs, they are wrong. They use the wrong significance. But it is significant when men are from particular ethnic and religious communities who work in gangs and who get away with violence towards women and children. But it's not the significance ascribed by the racists. And when I first wrote about the exploitation into prostitution of young white girls in Blackpool in 2004, I was immediately placed on Islamophobia watch. I did have friends who told me I should be proud, but it didn't particularly feel like it at the time. And they basically said this, that in me discussing, and I thought very carefully in the oh-so-liberal Guardian newspaper, about the poor police practice in their refusal to uncover what was essentially a sexually exploitative pimping gang towards white girls in Blackpool. When I suggested that this was highly significant, but not in the way the BNP said, of course, what Islamophobia Watch said about me was that I had fed vitriol to the BNP, I'd given them ammunition. Now what I would argue, and I argued then and I would argue now, is that the reluctance and the failure of white liberals to tackle these issues, and in fact to hold the hands of extremists, gives nothing but ammunition to the BNP, to fascists and racists. And I'm left wondering what's happened to feminism. What's happened to white Western feminists in that we're so terrified of the label of racist or Islamophobic that we sell our sisters down the river and collude with men who mean nothing but harm to women within their communities and cultures. And I include the Vatican, which I would describe as fundamentalist. The ideas and the practice that comes from the Vatican is entirely fundamentalist. I would include those from the Orthodox Jewish community in Stamford Hill who have routinely covered up child sexual abuse and who have routinely said it can be dealt with in the back rooms of the rabbi's home. And of course, I would include Islam, and I would include every single fundamentalist religion. What's different, as has already been pointed out very eloquently at this conference, about Islam, is that you have the male secular left supporting them over women. Now, one example of this is the media kerfuffle around the publication of the book, Does God Hate Women? I don't know if you remember this publication. Whatever you think of the book, and it's not perfect, it was a very interesting examination of religion and of misogyny. And this is what the liberal press said about it. They denounced the authors as inflammatory in the extreme. This was in the Independent paper. Authors who produce torrents of invective and show no desire to go beyond name-calling and distortion. The Guardian, paper which I write for, accused them of crudeness and lack of insight. It was staggered anyone wanted to publish them, and concluded that only a base desire to make money could explain the release of a profoundly intellectually dishonest, hysterical and bizarre work. And this particular passage that I'll read you from the book, and I'd just like to know what is so inaccurate about it. Well, what can one say? Religious authorities and conservative clerics worship a wretchedly cruel, unjust, vindictive executioner of a god. They worship a god of 10-year-old boys, a god of playground bullies, a god of rapists, of gangs, of pimps. They worship, despite rhetoric about justice and compassion, a god who sides with the strong against the weak, a god who is a male and who gangs up with other males against women. They worship a thug. They worship a god who thinks little girls should be married to grown men. They worship a god who looks on in approval when a grown man rapes a child because he is married to her. They worship a god who thinks women should receive 80 lashes with a whip because their hair wasn't completely covered. They worship a god who is pleased when 3 brothers hack their sisters to death with axes because one of them married without their father's permission. And of course, if we think about what happens under Sharia law, we can see examples, but not only under Sharia law. Devout Catholics marry their 7- and 8-year-old girls in full wedding regalia to Christ, and my partner's niece was married aged 16 to a man that she had never met on her own before, because she lives under Jewish Orthodox rule of her father. And this is someone who came from a liberal, secular family and who got bitten by the bug of religious fundamentalism. And so, I'd just like to ask why male left organisations and individuals, and of course patriarchal governments, work with religions without requiring them to demonstrate their commitments to women's human rights. Where is the international condemnation that we saw under apartheid? Where is the parallel? And if we actually look at the hypocrisy, nothing illustrates it more than left men and this particular issue than the vastly different treatment of Ayaan Hirsi Ali with someone like Tariq Ramadan. And Ramadan, who is supposedly seen as a moderate face of Islam, despite the fact that he's spoken out against equality of women, presumably because his critique of capitalism rings all the bells for the left. And we know that Hirsi Ali was berated, including by the Guardian newspaper, for her condemnation of fundamentalist religion, and yet he was lauded. We also saw this when Ken Livingstone invited Karydawi to City Hall and embraced him, despite the fact that Karydawi would like to see me, as a lesbian, a feminist and a woman, punished very severely. Where is the alliance for feminism under this type of pandering to extremism? And I would argue very strongly, just to finish, that you cannot possibly have feminism and religion together. They are vastly incompatible. There are women who the government insist they have consulted from the so-called Muslim community when they develop their policies. In reality, they have not consulted women who were born into Muslim communities who are secular and feminist. And that means that by default, these women's voices are not heard. And I think it's up to white women, white feminists, to ally ourselves with our sisters under oppression and not to the men who wish to abuse and oppress them. Thank you. Just if I could address the point our friend made over here about the use of the term white feminist, which I used. I used it very explicitly because in the UK, with the male-led left, the only religious fundamentalists that they will defend are those of colour, because of the skewed view that our enemy's enemy is our friend, and also because of the fear, which I would call a hideously cowardly fear, of being called racist. And there lies the problem, because so many people deliberately or ignorantly confuse religion and ethnicity. And so we constantly hear the issue about Muslim women, for example, being racistly attacked because they are wearing the burqa or the veil, when in fact it is a complete skewed view of a chosen religion, and in fact one, I would argue, no woman can choose freely at all, and racism. And then to our American British friend, I would agree with 90% of what you say. The one thing that I don't agree with is when you say that extremism is always fueled by ignorance and fear. Much religious extremism is fueled by the desire of patriarchs to gain more power and control over women and their children. And it's actually true multiculturalism in the way that liberals speak of it and religious extremists speak of it in this country really is multi-faithism. That's what it is. It's provided the rationale under the disguise of respecting cultural difference for respecting the rights of the patriarch to control fiefdoms in which they have power over women and children. So we mustn't forget that that's the rationale for many religious extremists also.